Hello and welcome to the Warhammer YouTube channel. Today we'll be talking about Warcry, the new skirmish combat game set in the Age of Sigmar universe, and we'll be specifically talking about the Cypher Lords faction. We'll be using some math to examine the different troop choices and how they compare to the rest of the game, and we'll be coming up with a starting list idea. We'll be examining some of the different abilities and discussing tactics on how to use them to help you get started with this game. So let's get into the data. Before I examine the spreadsheet, you'll notice a lot of colors in the spreadsheet, and this will give you some idea of what the coloring means. So things in the green and yellow are roughly average values, green being on the better side of average, yellow being on the lower side, and the more blue you get, the better that value is compared to other units in the game, and the more red you get, the worse it is compared to everything else in the game. Now, a lot of the values don't exactly fit the normal curve perfectly, but it's just a kind of a rough guide. Okay. So let's look at the data. And luckily in this case, I think everything can fit on the screen at once. This is one of the Chaos factions, which means there's only one leader choice to talk about. So there's not much, I don't have to go through a whole process of describing the leader and then describing the troops. So my overall thoughts on this warband here, what you're going to see here is overall very low durability. So if you notice here, you have a 20 wound leader, 15 wound elite, and then everything else is only 10 wounds, even these ones that are a little bit pricey. So you don't have a lot of wounds on the table. You don't really have true chaff, so 75 points is your cheapest unit. It's a little pricey for chaff. It's a little cheap for line infantry. Doesn't really perform as well as line infantry, so it's just not a great chaff faction. To me, this faction feels a little bit like a more extreme version of like the Unmade faction. I think all of these Chaos warbands are somewhat in the middle of the road. They're kind of like seem to be what the actual game was designed around, and all of the Sigmar factions are kind of extreme in one way or the other. This is of the core set of Chaos factions. This one to me feels like it's slid a little bit more towards that min-max kind of scale. So some things here are very extreme, other things are very extreme on the other end. So this might be a little trickier to play than other things such as like the Iron Golems or the Untamed Beasts, which are very kind of beginner friendly. This one might take a little bit more nuance. You could potentially misplay your hand and get wiped off the table very easily, or you could with a little bit of skill crush opponents left and right. So one of the keys to success here, a lot of options in this warband for those 2-inch weapons, and that's going to be big, and I think that's going to be a central strategy in overcoming your lack of tabletop durability, is forcing your enemy to take an extra action to move in on you, and therefore get fewer attacks on you. And a lot of the options in this warband do a lot of damage, so even with a 2-inch weapon, you're doing a lot of damage. So the trade-off here is they have low durability, but they're able to do a lot of damage at 2 inches, meaning they can probably do as much as other similar units are doing in 2 attack actions. They can do in 1, and they can do it from 2 inches. So there's going to, I think a lot of the strategy in this warband is going to be making use of these 2-inch weapons. And this warband in general, when we get into the abilities, there's just a lot of tricks up your sleeve. You have a lot of different abilities, and a lot of the abilities can be used by anybody in the warband. That's and they're pretty nice. So there's just lots of good tricks that you can do with this warband. Okay, so what's up with the boss, the Thrall Master? If you saw my best and worst of videos, you're probably familiar with him anyway. He turned out to be good in that faction. He has the best base attack profile in the game. Him and the Unmade boss they have the best just pure damage output. They do the most damage per action of anybody, and you can see here right in the stats, 1 attack or 5 attacks, base damage 2, critical 6. It's huge. You really just, if you can multiply attacks by criticals, you can kind of get a good sense for how much damage output a fighter does, and that's a pretty big one there, 5 times 6. And just in general, a lot of 5 attack models in this warband. So all these things with 5 attacks are going to be in a pretty high tier for damage output. Okay, so we only have one choice of elite, and that's this Luminant. So he's 175 points, so firmly in the elite category, and he's also our most durable troop option. So don't really have a choice. I think you're going to need to take him in a list. So we'll just there's nothing to really compare him to. He's the only thing in that category in this list, and he takes the Mystic Rune, which we'll get to in a second. We have basically 2 styles of infantry. You have Mirror Blades and Mindbounds, and each of those have a 2-inch variant and a 1-inch variant. They make you pay 5 extra points for the 2-inch variant, but they compensate. So not only do you get an extra inch, so in a lot of warbands, when you pay, if you take a 2-inch variant, they'll like subtract an attack. So here, this one goes down, it goes from 5 to 4 attacks, but they also up the criticals. So so instead of just being purely 20% less damage, the fact that you've upped the criticals means that it's actually not quite, you're not sacrificing quite as much. It's not equivalent amount of damage, but it's not nearly as bad as if these had the same critical. So still pretty good at damage. I think it's around 10% lower damage, but 10% lower damage being done at 2 inches instead of 1. That's pretty big. And same kind of trade-off here. You're doing 25% fewer attacks, but you're doing 25% more damage on a critical, which is going to translate to somewhere in the, 12-ish% less damage output, if I had to guesstimate it. And you're doing that at 1 inch extra range. So I think these are pretty good values for that 5 points that you're paying. But we'll slide over in the spreadsheet and get a feel for how that really plays out in a second. Okay. I think now would be a good time to talk about the runes. So the leader and the Illuminate take the Mystic Rune. We'll see what that means. Everybody else takes the Minion Rune. So that's interesting. All of our regular troops that aren't Illuminate take Minion, and all the 2-inch weapon variants also take Destroyer Rune. So let's hop over to the abilities and see what we have. Okay. So universal runes for this warband. There's quite a lot of good ones. This is an interesting warband in that there's 3 universal, or 3, I guess, faction universal abilities. You have these Throwing Stars and Chakrams. So this is pretty standard ability. A lot of warbands have it. You roll 2 dice, each 4 or 5. The fighter within 6 takes 1 damage. And each 6, they take a number of points equal to the value of the ability. And so this is pretty nice. It's probably for low damage, low strength attackers, it's probably going to outperform Onslaught, but I've actually calculated it all on the table. We'll get to that in a bit. When you're trying to make that decision on which ability should you use in a particular activation. Acrobatic Leap, this is a fun one, I think, for a double, which means it's very reliable. This fighter can fly when making move actions. The only restriction is you can't fly upwards more than 3 inches. Luckily, all the Warcry scenery is 3 inches tall, so basically this is not too restrictive in the current Warcry scenario landscape. So very handy moving around the battlefield, and the fact that it's cheap means I think this one's going to get a lot of use in practicality. Let me just go ahead and slide down to the last of the universals. Do you have a universal quad? This is an upgraded version of Rampage that adds on flying. So yeah, you can do the same bonus move with Rampage, but you get to fly as long as it's not upward more than 3 inches. So handy. I don't know how big of an impact on the game that's going to have. Quads are a little bit rare, and yeah, but there's no other quad ability to pick from here. Since it's strictly an upgraded version of Rampage, there's no reason you would ever use Rampage. So it will get some use in the game just by the fact of being the only realistic quad action. Okay, so let me examine the Destroyer rune. So this is the one that the 2-inch weapon troops take, and this is roll a dice for each visible enemy fighter within 2 inches. On a 4 or 5, allocate 1 damage point to the fighter being rolled for. On a 6, allocate a number of damage points. So this sounds a lot like throwing stars and chakrams. So in the spreadsheet, I've calculated a column for showing you what the different damage outputs for throwing stars is at the different dice value levels. So just when I cover low sweeping blow, it's going to be the same values from that same column. But choosing whether or not to use this ability for your 2-inch weapon guy versus using Onslaught is going to be important. So this is one of those game design things I think you need to be aware of if you try to play Warcry to any level of competency, is that Onslaught is a universal ability, and it's just very, very good. It adds a lot of damage to your attacks, and there's a lot of abilities in the game that underperform against Onslaught in every possible case scenario. So when you're evaluating whether or not an attacker should use one of your faction specific abilities, you need to have an understanding of whether or not that ability outperforms Onslaught and under potentially what conditions it outperforms or underperforms Onslaught. So you need to know when to use Onslaught and when not to. I would say if you don't want to think about all that stuff and don't want to have to worry about it, just use Onslaught and leave the rest up. Onslaught's safe, always does a good job, and it's just a clear winner. Okay. The leader abilities, you have a custom faction leader ability. Until the end of the battle round, subtract 1 from attacks characteristics of attack actions made by enemy fighters within 6 inches of this fighter. So it's going to be a nice bubble. If you get this guy near the middle of the board or something, or near a lot of your other fighters, then it's going to really add a lot of durability. I did the calculations. On average, this is going to reduce damage taken by 30.54%. So if you have a scenario that says, like, your leader needs to stay alive, or everybody in like the shield deployment group needs to stay alive, then an ability like this is going to really help you stay alive. So just make sure that your leader is in the shield group. I think generally most of the scenarios you're trying to protect shield, so I would probably recommend leader in shield anyway. But yeah, so if you have your leader near the group that's needing to be protected, then he can just throw off this triple, and everybody in that bubble is going to be taking, or everybody that's getting attacked by a fighter that's within that bubble is going to be taking 30.54 less damage on average. So very nice, very good triple value, and yeah, I like it. This the Mystic, which is what our leader and our single elite troop choice is the Luminate. It's what they take. It's Shadowy Recall. So you can just pick up a minion rune mark, which is literally every other fighter in your warband. You can pick up a friendly minion rune mark fighter within 12 inches and then drop them anywhere else within the distance of the ability of that dice. So if you use it on a 6, you can pick up a minion from within 12, and it doesn't say wholly within 12, just within 12, and drop them within, but not wholly within 6 inches of where you where the Mystic is. So this is a way you can kind of teleport your standard troops around the board. Very handy for sneaking up on people. All of a sudden, this triple goes off, and it could potentially drastically change the tactical situation on the board. I wish there was something similar where you could move an enemy fighter away, but this is a good enough trick. And this is one of those things I think that makes this warband like very tricky and like just devious, and there's lots of these little tricks that you can do there. So a good warband in the right capable hands. All right, moving back to our stats. So let me scroll on. You can see just from the points per wound perspective, almost everything but our cheapest infantry is a pretty bad deal in just the cost per wounds. It's durability and price per durability is not a feature of this warband. Okay, so these columns, if you haven't watched my videos before, this is roughly speaking how many attacks from fighters of strength 2 are required to kill on average this fighter, and from strength 3, strength 4, 5, and 6. And how this differs from previous videos that I've done is I've reworked this. Instead of just taking an overall average of damage for the whole game of base damage and criticals and computing everything off that, I've kind of separated things out into categories. So it turns out, lower strength attacks, they typically have lower damage characteristics as well. So the numbers change a little bit. So those are this is realistically, if you're up against a strength 3 fighter, this is realistically about how many attacks are going to be required. This distribution of values makes it seem like strength is a really important attribute, but it's really not. I still stand behind the information in my strength and toughness video that I did. But the reason these numbers shift so much is that the actual base damage and critical damage values actually change drastically between the different strength values. So all the information in that video was calculated based on what happens if you just increase the strength value of a fighter profile by 1, and across the board, how much damage output does that change. And so anyway, moving on, you can see that a lot of these, so you have like strength 6 attack, it's going to take a little bit less than 4, so on average, pretty much everything in this warband could get one-shotted by most strength 6 attackers in this game. So my attacks to kill, and likewise the points per attack to kill values, these really, it's a way of taking the wounds characteristic and the toughness and factoring it into how the distribution real world in the game works out. So this is weighting appropriately the frequency of all the different strength values of all the different fighter profiles, instead of just a pure average of all those different strength values. This is a weighted metric, and then you divide the point value of the fighter by that metric, and you get the number of points for durability. So this is the average durability of the fighters, and this is the points you're paying for each of those points of durability. So our best value for tabletop durability does come in our low-end troop choices, but you're going to have to make a decision over here whether or not the damage output they're doing is worth that little bit of gain you get in durability price. So in these columns, I've calculated how much damage does this do on average against toughness 3, 4, and 5 fighters. This is a much easier thing to calculate than the damage received from the different strength values. So if you take all of these and you weight them appropriately based on how frequently toughness 2, 3, 4, and 5 occur in the game, that's how I get the effective damage output metric. And you can see the Thrall Master is not only a very high value, he is the actual top. He is the highest base effective damage in the game. He's tied with the Unmade boss, and I think, notably the Unmade boss, I think has a range 2 attack at 8.49. So if I had to say which one was better, I would say the Unmade one is better. But the Unmade one is a more expensive leader. So they're both very noteworthy in the damage department, and kind of he's a clear centerpiece of this faction, in that he's doing that. Anything that's doing that much damage in this game is a huge problem. You're able to really just kill a lot of things very quickly. If you notice, the average damage versus toughness 3 is 10, and if you look at how many toughness 3 models have 10 wounds, it's pretty much most of them. So this guy could clean the table of 2 toughness 3 fighters every turn if he chose to. If he was swarmed by toughness 3 fighters, he would make short work of them. And okay, the Luminant also does amazing damage. This is not the best in the game, but it's close. It's a very, very much top tier damage output. And both of our Mirror Blade versions do great damage. So they do great damage. Let me slide over and try to get the durability stat into view as well. So they have the same actual durability as the Mindbound, but they're more expensive. So you're taking a big hit in the points per durability, but you're getting a great value in points per damage. So this is a real tricky trade-off, and this is why I think I prefer those 2-inch weapons, is because with the 2-inch weapons, you can see here you're not sacrificing that much in your damage output, and you're going to be able to make up for your obvious weakness here in this very low durability. So you're going to be able to skate around and potentially take less attacks from your enemies. Okay, the Mindbound just aren't that remarkable. They're very close for the 1-inch version to the 2-inch version, so I just don't think the 1-inch version is really worth the extra. I think the extra 5 points you pay seem to be worth it, because the net result and difference in damage output is very low. It's a lower difference than what you get here with the Mirror Blades. So this is probably the best 5 points you can spend in this game, because not only you do get not much damage reduction, you get an extra inch of range to help with your durability, and you get the Destroyer rune. And the Destroyer rune is going to be a very nice rune to take, as we'll see in a second. Okay, so I've added columns to show you so this is a column for Onslaught. So if you use the Onslaught ability, Onslaught adds 1 to the attack's characteristic. This shows you, this takes your effective damage, and this is basically the effective damage if you had 1 extra attack. So everything in this warband can do pretty good damage as long as you add an extra attack to it, but I mean, it takes the Thrallmaster into just stratospheric levels. This column here for Onslaught Delta, this is just this number minus this number. So how much improvement do you get by spending that double on Onslaught? So you get 1.7 for the Thrallmaster, 1.7 extra average damage for the Thrallmaster, and the worse attack profile you get, the less improvement you get. So you can see here, with a 2-inch weapon using Onslaught, you're not very much behind the damage output of the Mindbound at all. So this is another point in favor of the regular Mindbound over the double-bladed Mindbound over the regular Mindbound, because the regular Mindbound doesn't take Onslaught as well as this guy. Okay, let's examine the data for the Throwing Stars and Chakras ability, as well as the Low Blow ability that the Mirror Blade and the Mindbound get to take with their minion rune. So I misspoke earlier when I was talking about the ability runes. The Low Blow does not do the same damage as the Throwing Stars, because the Throwing Star does you roll 2 dice, and the Low Blow looks similar, but it's only 1 dice per enemy. So what I've tabulated here is there's a column here. Well, I have my 2 columns for Onslaught, and then we're now with all the stuff in purple here, we're examining different data. So we're examining, this is for each dice value, what the effect of these abilities are. So for the Throwing Stars ability, if you use it on a 1, you get an average of 1 damage for that ability. If you use it on a 2, you get an average of 1.33 damage done, and so on and so forth. So if you use it on a 6, that's going to be effectively worth an average of 2.67 damage for using that ability. So pretty nice. The Low Blow ability does, since it's only 1 dice, but it's the same system, you just conceptually think of it as half of this value right here is how much you're going to do to each enemy within that, I believe it is 2 inches. So I'll get to that in a second. So for Throwing Stars, deciding whether or not to use the Throwing Stars ability, and I should mention that the Thrallmaster and the Luminate don't have the privilege of using the no, I'm sorry. They do have the ability to use throwing stars. It's universal. So deciding whether or not a fighter should use throwing stars, you need to keep in mind that it's a double, and you can also use onslaught for the same fighter. So if you examine the value of throwing stars, you can see it's doing this much damage on average depending on the dice value, and onslaught, if you use onslaught on a fighter, he is doing this much additional damage. So this is the damage value that you get for your double using onslaught, and this is the damage value you get on average using throwing stars. So determining whether or not to use one versus the other, you have to keep in mind how many actions of onslaught you're going to get to use. So if you use onslaught at the beginning of an activation, and that fighter is going to get to use 2 attack actions, you have to conceptually double this onslaught value, because you're gonna. So if you use it on the Thrall Master, he's going to get a total of 3.4 extra damage on average from using that ability. Whereas if you use the same double on throwing stars, and let's say you got it on throwing stars with a value of 4, he's only going to do 2 extra damage on average from throwing stars. So it's going to be much better to use that double on onslaught for the Thrall Master in that scenario than it would be on throwing stars. But in that same scenario, if you had to move the Thrall Master and then you were going to get an attack in and then you wanted to use throwing stars, then it would be better to use throwing stars versus onslaught, because you knew that you could get an average of 2 on a 4 from throwing stars, whereas you would only get an average of 1.7 extra damage by using onslaught for only 1 attack action. So it really, whether or not you should use one or the other really depends on what the dice value is and how much extra damage you're going to get from onslaught and how many attack actions you're going to get out of onslaught. I would say, as a rule of thumb, if you don't want to memorize all this table, just try to save throwing stars for the higher dice values, and maybe save throwing stars for your lighter troops here, because a little mind bound here for 75 points, you get this on a 6, he can do 2.67 extra damage, and that's going to be more damage than he's going to be able to do. And that's better. I think that's a better number than his, or very close to his actual base damage. So that's like basically the same as getting a whole extra attack round from the mind bound. So this does not scale with the strength of the fighter, whereas onslaught sort of does. Okay, so that being said, the low blow ability, this is the one that the 2-inch weapon guys take. So whether or not you should use this one versus onslaught gets a little bit more complicated, because this is an area of effect type ability. It affects everybody within 2. So it's whether or not you should use it. It's doing half the damage to each fighter, as you see in this column, and whether or not you should use it is going to depend on how many enemies are within that 2-inch bubble. So, and it's going to depend on how many enemies in that 2-inch bubble and what the value of this of the dice value that you're going to spend it on. So, what you see here, how to read this is for each double value, so like double 1, double 2, how many enemies need to be within that 2-inch bubble for you to select using low blow versus onslaught. So, for example, if you have less than 4 enemies and you're using a mirror blade, you want to spend this ability on a mirror blade, and you're spending a double 1, you have less than 4 enemies, it's not a good idea. You're going to do more damage output if you just did your onslaught. So what we see here for the low blow columns is we're comparing, so only the mirror blade with the glaive and the mindbound with the double-bladed sword can use this ability. So I have these separated into 2 sets of columns, one for the mirror blade and one for the mindbound, and this is, you're comparing it whether or not you should use this ability against whether or not that fighter has 1, if you're going to use 1 attack action or 2. So if you're in an activation and you have potentially 2 actions of attack that you can use, using your double on the low blow ability is going to have to be much better. You're going to need much better dice. There's going to need to be more enemies around for that area of effect, because using 2 actions of attacks with Onslaught is going to be a lot more damage output. So how to read this is, if you're, for example, using a Mirror Blade with Glaive, and let's say you have, let's say you're using it on you have a double 4, there's 2 enemies within 2 inches. Should you use Low Blow or should you use Onslaught? Well, if you only have 1 attack action left, it looks like the break, you have the requisite 2 enemies within that range, you should go ahead and use Low Blow. If you had, in that case, if you had 2 full attack actions that you could use that turn, you would need 4 enemies to be within 2 inches for it to make sense for you to use Low Blow as opposed to using Onslaught. So if you only have those 2 guys within range, it makes more sense to use Onslaught. You're going to get more total damage output. Now, the numbers could change. If you wanted to do small amounts of damage to more people than doing large amounts of damage to fewer people, then just by all means just use Low Blow anyway. But this is the break-even point where you actually benefit from using Low Blow in terms of total damage output. So, and same goes for Mindbound. Since Mindbound is a lower damage output version of Mirror Blade, and this ability does not scale with the strength of the fighter, he's generally going to require fewer enemies to be within that 2-inch bubble to make this ability worthwhile. So you might want to take note of the values on the screen. If you were going to play this faction, I think this is handy values to keep, because this is a really tricky thing to keep in your head. I would say, just as a general rule, only use it on 3-ups. Threes are better. Probably 4s are better. Would be ideal. And if you have 2 attack actions left, make sure it's 2 enemies within range if you're Mirror Blade, or 1 enemy in range of your Mind Blade, and try to make 4 enemies in range if you have 2 attacks left, or 2 enemies in range if you have 2 attacks left from your Mind Blade. But even the summarized version of that is a little bit hard to remember, I think. So this is a really tricky one. It's nice that it's an area of effect thing, but it only outperforms Onslaught situationally, so it's a little bit tricky. Okay, so moving back to the beginning, I think start talking about my MVPs. I mean, obviously in this faction, the Thrallmaster is the realistic MVP. He's, a beast on the table, does huge amounts of damage, and using his ability, his mystic ability, he'll be able to teleport things around, lots of cool stuff, lots of tricks. And if I had to give an MVP, true MVP would be him. I like to give my MVPs to the actual troops, because we don't have a choice. You're going to take the Thrallmaster. So what of the things that you get the real choice on? I think I'm going to have to go with the Mindbound with the double-bladed sword, just because he's a slightly better value than the Mirror Blade with Glaive. You're probably more likely to use that cool area of effectability with the Mindbound version, because Mirror Blade does more damage output, and so you probably ended up just using Onslaught with him as well. So I think a lot of my list that I was coming up with, I ended up throwing in more Mindbounds. But one cool thing about this faction, as we'll see when I get into the list building, is that it ends up looking a lot, all the good lists that I could come up with ended up being very close to the starter box. So a lot of the other Chaos factions, when you start working out what's a good value unit, what isn't, and you start building lists off of that data, the starter boxes start looking kind of weird and just kind of like a random assortment of things. But in this one, I think they did a much better job of actually giving you a really, really solid list potential in the starter box. So that being said, I'm only going to be giving you one list with this one, which is the It's been a while since I've just given one list idea, but I really couldn't think of a better one. I came up with a few other alternatives, but I think I just kept coming back to this one as the best one, and it's the one that you can build with just, I believe, one box. So let's go with it. So obviously the Thrallmaster, one Luminant, which is all you get in one box, 3 Mirror Blades with Glaive. So the 2-inch weapons there, I'm utilizing those 2-inch weapons to keep my guys alive just a little bit longer because durability is a problem in this warband. And 3 Mind Bounds with the double-bladed sword. So I think you can do this all with one box. I don't actually own the box. I don't know if you actually have the ability to build. I know you get 3 Mirror Blades and you get 3 Mind Bounds, but I'm not sure if you actually get 3 of them with the potential to build these weapon choices 3 times or not. But if you don't, I apologize. But I've been meaning to give the most box-friendly good list that I can in each faction, but I think this is box-friendly currently. So meaning the best list you can buy, only buying one box of them, and so this is the best list I was able to come up with. The only problem with this list, so it's 8 fighters. The only problem with this list is it still leaves points on the table. So you have this list comes out to 980, and that's 20 points left. It's a little bit out of my comfort zone in terms of how much I'm leaving on the table, but you don't have. There's not a lot of great other options for combinations here. You can see I took the most expensive Mindbound options I could and the most expensive Mirror Blade options, and I still left 20 points on the table. It's not enough points to buy an extra unit, or if I change to, one extra Luminant, it doesn't free up enough points for another cheap anything. So I think this was the best list I was able to come up with. So sorry if that's not shocking and it's exactly the list that you had and that everybody is playing, but I think that's just how the cookie crumbles with this faction. It's probably, I think this is it's just going to be very straightforward. Everyone's probably going to have the same list. It's going to look very similar, and until they start adding more things into the game, this one is just it's going to play well. You're going to have fun, and it's not a terribly underpowered faction, not particularly overpowered either. I don't think. I think that you're going to struggle against some lists. Notably, it's not the fastest moving warband ever. Doesn't have any tools to really compensate. Outside of that, you have the teleporting your minion thing. That's pretty cool, but you're only teleporting one minion at a time. There's no area of effect, something like the Wa that the orcs have, where everybody within 6 inches gets a huge bonus to their movement. So you don't get massive boosts to your movement, but it's not bad. So hope you enjoyed, and I'll be back next time with another non-chaos faction. So I think the only one left will be Stormcast after that. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.